Okay, we begin in Toronto, though, where the Ford government is using controversial means to keep schools open. 55,000 education workers are threatening to strike on Friday. To prevent that, the province is fast-tracking legislation that would impose a contract on them and bar them from the picket line. Now, this is the second time Premier Doug Ford has used the notwithstanding clause to override the Canadian Charter. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau isn't happy about it.
Using the notwithstanding clause to suspend workers' rights is wrong. I know that collective bargaining negotiations are sometimes difficult, but it has to happen. It has to be done in a respectful, thoughtful way at the bargaining table. The suspension of people's rights is something that you should only do in the most exceptional circumstances.
So we asked to speak to Ontario's Attorney General or to have a Progressive Conservative MPP join this panel. Both requests were denied. Notwithstanding that, we have reached leaders of Ontario opposition parties. Peter Tabuns is the interim leader for the Ontario NDP. John Fraser is the interim leader for the Ontario Liberals. Gentlemen, thanks for joining me. Mr. Tabuns, I'd like to start with you. I know you are opposed to this legislation, but after 2 years of COVID-driven school interruptions, a lot of parents may agree with what the government is doing here, at least the end result of keeping kids in school. What's your sense on that?
Well, I understand the frustration of parents. The reality, though, is what the government is doing is undermining the education system. What they did in the healthcare system, where they capped wages and drove people out, has led to a crisis in our emergency rooms, has led to hallway medicine, has led to a variety of problems that they should have known would happen. What they're trying to do in the education system is exactly the same. They're trying to drive people away from the system by underpaying them. We're in a situation now where we have many people who work in the education system who are living in poverty, who are relying on food banks. That's wrong. And if you continue down that road, you can be sure that it is going to make it far more difficult for children to get the support they need in the classroom, to ensure that there are lunchrooms that are properly monitored, that rooms are cleaned. This approach of the government is one that is going to do to the education system what they've done to the healthcare system.
Mr. Fraser, Liberal governments in the past, they haven't used the notwithstanding clause, but they have used legislation to impose contracts and limit salaries in the education system. Why is this different other than the use of the notwithstanding clause, at least in terms of what the end goal is?
Well, look, I don't, I said it earlier today, I don't believe that use, in particular Bill 115, in settling a contract was the right thing for us to do. I said to the government, learn from our mistakes. It ended up breaking trust with people who we worked with for 9 years to build up our education system. So there's a big risk when you do that. Using the notwithstanding clause to settle contract negotiations instead of what it was intended for, which is to settle disputes between the federal government and provincial governments, it's just simply wrong. And they're imposing a contract on the lowest paid workers in our education system, who are mostly women. So they're the school secretaries, they're early childhood educators, they're educational assistants who work with the most exceptional, vulnerable children in our system. And the government is using this tool to essentially to bully them. And I think in some ways it's been suggested to make an example of them to other workers who may have to bargain.
I would love to ask this question now of a Conservative who is on the panel, but as we said off the top, they declined to participate in this. So, Mr. Tabuns, I'm going to put it to you. I was struck today by the irony of Premier Ford sending a lawyer into court to defend his right not to testify at the commission that's happening here in Ottawa, while sending Mr. Lecce into the legislature to take away the collective bargaining rights of education workers. I wonder, how do you square that circle of the Premier's rights should be protected, but the workers' rights should be eliminated right now?
Well, I don't think you can square that circle. Respect the rights of working people, pay them decently, make sure they don't have to rely on food banks. And frankly, when it comes to the leader of this province, he has a responsibility to show up at that inquiry to explain what was done, what he was thinking at the time. He left the people of Ottawa under siege for 28 days. He can go up to Ottawa for a day or two and explain what his thinking was, and why he didn't act more quickly to defend the people of this province. I don't think there's any way to defend what he's done, either to the workers or to his refusal to be publicly accountable.
Mr. Fraser, same question to you. Your thoughts on the Premier's extraordinary attempts to protect his right to parliamentary privilege and his extraordinary efforts to take away CUPE's right to strike?
Well, first of all, Peter's right. The Premier should just testify and explain to the residents of Ottawa why he didn't take action for 2 weeks and apologize. And, I can think of 3 premiers in the province of Ontario who all, when they were called to testify either to an inquiry or a committee or in court, all answered that call because they know that that's their job. That's their responsibility. They didn't shirk their responsibility. And it is pretty incredible that the Premier would shirk this responsibility and at the same time say to the lowest paid workers in our education system, the people we depend on to ensure that our schools are safe, welcoming places to learn, to impose a contract on them. It's just, it is unbelievable. And it's almost like they don't care what people think. I can't believe that they're doing it.
All right, I want to get back just to the issue of the labor issue. Mr. Tabuns, start with you. We are in a situation now where the union has said they will protest or do some sort of a job action on Friday, regardless of the status of the legislation. And we heard from Education Minister Lecce yesterday saying that it was the union's refusal to take a strike option off the table that led to this. I've never seen a union willingly agree to give up labor action or job action during negotiations. I mean, what do you make of the Education Minister's position there?
I think the Education Minister is just simply providing cover for himself. If he was serious about coming to an agreement, he'd be at the negotiating table. He wouldn't have left that table. He has the power, he has the financial resources, he has the legal power to sit down, negotiate a fair deal, and make sure that things go forward in our schools on Friday and in the days after that. I don't think he's interested, frankly. I think he's interested in beating up on these workers. I think that's indefensible.
Mr. Fraser, just to build on that, though, we are going to have some sort of a job action, it seems, from CUPE on Friday. We've seen school boards, including, I believe, the Toronto District School Board, saying we have to close our schools. We can't function without these workers. But this legislation calls for very stiff fines for unions, leaders, and individuals should they take some sort of a job action. So where do you think this goes on Friday if there is not sort of a negotiated resolution between now and the end of this week?
Well, first of all, it's not fair. And it's really just simply a case of bad faith bargaining. Bargaining from the government's end has been in the media from day one. But here's the thing. This legislation the government's put forward, they didn't write it over the weekend. It would have taken at least a week or two to write this legislation. So the government's intent was very clear. They were going to use this to make an example of the lowest paid workers in our schools. Right? And they were going to use, as some have described, a nuclear option. They were going to use the notwithstanding clause to solve labor negotiations and get what they wanted. It's simply wrong. The government had intent to do this, I think, for more than just Monday morning. As I said, you don't write this legislation overnight. It just doesn't happen that way.
And Mr. Tabuns, this is the third time they threatened to use it. The second time they've actually started to use it. I mean, the notwithstanding clause is in the Constitution, but it's not meant to be an easy button, right? It's meant to be for extreme cases. I mean, what are your thoughts just on the sort of the enthusiastic use of the notwithstanding clause by the Ford government?
Well, this is a government that doesn't seem to actually have any regard for constitutional rights and protections. That is willing to sweep them aside when it's in the way of their policy goals. I think they're wrong. I think that they are showing themselves to be a government that doesn't care what happens to our schools, to our parents, our children, to the workers who are in those schools, looking after our kids, making sure that they get the education that they need, making sure that they're safe. A disdain for democratic protections seems to go along with this disinterest in actually making the schools work well.
Okay. Gentlemen, we're going to have to leave it there. I'd like to thank you both for joining me tonight. That's Peter Tabuns. He's the interim leader for the Ontario NDP. John Fraser is the interim leader for the Ontario Liberals. A reminder, we did ask the Ford Conservatives to provide someone. They declined that opportunity. All right, so that was the opposition's reaction to Ontario's back-to-work legislation. Now we're going to hear from the union at the center of all of this. Laura Walton is president of CUPE's Ontario School Boards Council of Unions and an educational assistant. She lives in Toronto. Ms. Walton, I'd like to start with with this. We spoke to Education Minister Stephen Lecce yesterday. I want to get your reaction to his statement on why legislating this contract was necessary. Have a listen to this.
I would have preferred to have had a voluntary agreement signed yesterday, or at least a path to one, with the commitment that the union would take the strike off the table on Friday. But they didn't, and we're here, and we're acting, as we said we would, to make sure these kids stay in school.
Okay, so he says you wouldn't take strike action off the table. What's your response to what the Education Minister said?
Well, I'm really interested in how the Education Minister is spinning this. We got a phone call early Sunday morning asking us to come to a meeting. It was when I was here, not even with my full bargaining team, but with my co-lead and another member, where they provided us a pass and said, either you take this or we legislate it. That's not bargaining. That's an ultimatum. And I was reminded today that this government has never actually negotiated with us. In 2019, they legislated our wage in the midst of bargaining while we were sitting at the table. This time, they came with a full package that would be ripping away, our rights again. It seems like this government doesn't understand what their role is. And what's really interesting is they've really overstepped their role in the School Board Collective Bargaining Act, which is supposed to be between us and the school boards associations.
Mm-hmm. So what do you do now? What are you advising your members to do now? I mean, you got this ultimatum, as you described it, this take it or leave it or legislate it offer on Sunday, and now it's ramming through the legislature with attempts to have it in place by the end of this week. What do your workers do on Friday? What are you advising them to do?
So we are staying the course. We are here bargaining. We have just nicely received, late this morning, a printed copy for each of our bargaining team of the pass. We have gone through it. We had to request a pass that actually showed what changes were made because that wasn't provided to us originally. And now we are working together to see, hey, what can we do? Where can we go on this? And I think that that's really super important as we move forward as a team. We're going to keep working. It's just a bill that has been introduced into legislature. It has not been passed yet, much to, the chagrin perhaps of this minister who keeps talking about it being a done deal. It's not done yet. And we will carry on with the strike on Friday if there is no other, if a collective agreement has not been reached. But what really makes me sad about this is it didn't have to be this way. We served notice 150 days ago for this ministry to come and talk to us, for the School Boards Association to come and talk to us, to recognize that we're the lowest paid workers in the entire education sector, that we don't have this magnificent pension that this minister keeps talking about. We've only had 15 days of bargaining over 150 days. It seems so clear, and I want to agree with with John Fraser. This was not written overnight. This document we feel has probably been written since June, and they've just been waiting for when they could provide it to us.
I wonder if you could indulge me on some clarification, though. You say you're going to go ahead with the strike on Friday because at this moment the legislation isn't passed. But if the legislation is passed by Friday, that strike would be illegal, and individual members could be fined $4,000 a day, and the union, I think it's 500,000 or some very large number. I mean, do you go ahead with the strike if those financial penalties are in place?
Yes, and it'll be up to the workers. And we have been talking to workers, and the workers, contrary to what the Premier is talking, the workers have always been center in this fight. The workers are tired. They feel disrespected by this government, a government who capped their wages, a government who didn't recognize that they were on site in schools throughout this pandemic, a government that, didn't even, recognize them for the work that they have been doing and now is legislating them. And my understanding is actually today in Queen's Park said, this should be a sign for all other workers. Education workers, QP education workers, are tired of being disrespected. They're tired of workers being disrespected. They are just not sure why it is that this government feels the need to be so divisive. They are parents, often parents of students with needs themselves. None of us want to go on strike, but we can't afford to do our jobs any longer. There is a real concern about a mass exodus from this sector by education workers who are finally saying, I can't afford to do this. I'm going to go seek seek work elsewhere.
Just setting aside the argument the government is making, I'm sure you've heard it from parents. They don't want another disruption in the school system. So whether they agree with Minister Lecce's tactics or not, they may well agree with the sentiment that after a couple of years of kids being out of school, they can't really go through it again. I mean, do you understand that sentiment? And it seems to be something that perhaps the government is counting on in the way they're framing the actions that they're taking to stop you from walking off the job on Friday.
Listen, I'm a mom. I don't want my 16-year-old to be out of school either. But what I want even less than that is for a government who takes away the human rights and the charter rights of workers. What this does is set a precedent that every single time a worker tries to exercise their rights under the Canadian Charter, that the government can step in and strip them away. That's an extremely dangerous situation that we are in right now. And I really think that people need to seriously consider, what is it that this government is doing? This is not about a worker strike. There are other ways that this could have been avoided. What this is a stripping of workers' rights, an attack on the lowest paid workers, and an attack on a predominantly female workforce at a time where, they no longer can afford to keep going. It is completely, absolutely draconian, and I'm shocked because what we're hearing from parents is that yes, they don't want disruption either, but they do not want a government that is ripping away the rights of people. No one should be doing that. But a labor disruption, that's not exactly what I would call an emergency.
But the bottom line, Ms. Walton, is we do have a government, or you do have a government in Ontario that is doing that. They do have a sizable majority, and they seem intent on getting their way, and it seems like this will be done by Friday. They've taken away court challenges in this, so I wonder what next step your union has to potentially head this off. And if you do strike and they start fining your members $4,000, given what you said to us about the income levels of your members, I mean, how do they handle that? How does the union potentially pay for that?
Yeah. So the union will be there to support our workers as we have always done, and in a way that this government clearly cannot. And I think what we really need to be looking for in the next little while is, why is this minister not coming to the table and bargaining a real deal and taking a look at what it needs to keep the workforce going? In that legislated agreement, there is no, inclusion of extra services to keep our kids in school and keep them safe, keep them secure and successful. As a matter of fact, if you read what is actually coming in as our contract, many of the things that they claim that they're about are not actually contemplated. The proposals that we have on the table actually contemplate, how do we get services to support children? I think really the real intention of this government has become very clear. And, at some point, I think we all need to recognize that if we do not fight now as a society against this government, when do we say, as the government likes to say all the time, enough is enough? Okay. This is a government that claimed that they were working for workers, that they were about better jobs and bigger paychecks. And I think we saw this week that those were empty campaign promises and nothing more.
Okay, Laura Walton, we're going to leave it there. I suspect we may want to talk to you on Friday. Thank you very much. That's Laura Walton. She's the president of CUPE's Ontario School Boards Council of Unions.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.